War throughout history has been much more than a confrontation between armies. It has been a battleground where humanity has unleashed its darkest instincts. In ancient civilizations, war crimes were common, and many of these acts today would be unthinkable within international law. What was once justified as military strategies is now considered an atrocity. In this exploration, we will delve into the times of colossal empires and ruthless leaders who unleashed unimaginable horrors under the banner of conquest. From mass killings to brutal tortures, these stories not only left scars on the victims, but also shaped the trajectory of the societies that carried them out. Prepare to learn about the most terrifying crimes committed in the name of power, and how these acts of barbarity remain a grim reflection of the abuse of authority. The devastation of Tyre by Alexander the Great, the terror of conquest. In 332 BC, the ancient world witnessed one of the most devastating victories in military history, the fall of Tyre at the hands of the invincible Alexander the Great. As his forces swept through the vast Persian Empire with unprecedented speed and skill, Tyre, an island city located off the coast of modern-day Lebanon, became one of the last bastions of resistance. Known as the Queen of the Seas, Tyre was not only wealthy but also famous for its imposing fortifications and powerful navy, which had protected it for centuries from any attempts of invasion. However, when the leaders of Tyre refused to surrender to the Macedonian conqueror, they sealed their tragic fate. The city of Tyre, strategically located on an island more than half a kilometer from the mainland, was practically impregnable from the sea. Although formidable, Alexander's army lacked the resources to launch a direct naval assault against the city's mighty walls. But Alexander's determination knew no bounds. With a mix of tactical cunning and relentless brutality, the Macedonian king devised a plan that astonished the ancient world: to build a massive causeway, a sort of land bridge connecting the island to the mainland. This monumental engineering project not only challenged the capabilities of his army, but also the expectations of all who were present. The construction of the causeway was a feat of perseverance and desperation. For months, thousands of men worked day and night, transporting massive stones and building materials across the narrow waterway, separating the city from the shore. Meanwhile, the inhabitants of Tyre launched desperate attacks from their walls, using catapults, arrows, and ships to prevent Alexander's forces from completing their work. However, the Macedonian forces, which included engineers, soldiers, and allies, held firm, and eventually the causeway was completed, connecting the island to the mainland. The city, once impregnable, was now within reach of the Macedonian sword. Once Alexander's forces reached Tyre's walls, the resistance of the Tyrians was brutal, but not enough to stop the Macedonian offensive. The fall of the city was devastating. After hours of intense fighting, the walls were finally breached and the city was taken completely. The Macedonian army showed no mercy. According to historical accounts, more than 6,000 Tyrian men were massacred on the spot. The survivors, about 2,000, were subjected to one of the most brutal and public executions in ancient history. They were crucified along the shore, their bodies exposed for all to see as an extreme display of power and vengeance. The Roman historian Quintus Curtius Rufus, who documented Alexander's campaigns, emphasized that the executions were not only exemplary punishment, but also a psychological tactic intended to terrorize other cities and ensure that none would dare challenge Alexander's power. The crucifixions along the coast of Tyre were a bloody warning to all the peoples of the ancient world. Resisting Alexander the Great meant facing total destruction. The remaining 30,000 inhabitants of Tyre, including women, children, and the elderly, were captured and sold into slavery, a common fate for the defeated in antiquity. This act of mass enslavement was not only a lethal blow to the city, but also a strategy to fund Alexander's future campaigns. The Tyrians, who had once dominated maritime trade, now found themselves in the hands of their oppressors, a sad reminder of how the arrogance of an empire could be destroyed in a matter of days by the war machine of a single man. The fall of Tyre not only marked a high point in Alexander's campaign, but also a shift in the nature of military conquests. The brutality of Tyre's destruction was a clear message to all nations. Alexander's power was not measured merely by his battlefield victories, but by his ability to instill terror and utterly annihilate his enemies. The city of Tyre, in its final resistance, became a symbol of the devastation that accompanied the arrival of this Macedonian king, a legacy of suffering and submission that would endure in history. The brutal sack of Carthage, the total destruction of a civilization. Carthage, a thriving center of trade and culture on the North African coast, was for centuries one of Rome's primary rivals in the struggle for supremacy in the Mediterranean. Known for its formidable navy and vast trade network, the city was one of the most powerful of antiquity. However, after 3 long wars known as the Punic Wars, Carthage met its end in what is considered one of the most devastating war crimes in history, the Third Punic War, 149 to 146 BC. The rivalry between Rome and Carthage reached its climax in 149 BC, when Rome decided that Carthage must be eradicated entirely. The famous phrase of Cato the Elder, "Carthago delenda est," Carthage must be destroyed, echoed through the halls of the Roman Senate, reflecting the Romans' relentless determination. Even though Carthage had already been weakened in the 2 previous wars, the Romans were unwilling to leave anything to chance. The decision to destroy the city was made not only as a wartime strategy, but as a symbolic act of total annihilation, aimed at eliminating any possibility of Carthage rising again as a threat. The siege of Carthage lasted nearly 3 years and was a long, painful process, marked by the Romans' relentless tactics. During this time, the Carthaginians resisted with everything they had, but Roman superiority in both resources and strategy proved too much for a city already exhausted. Finally, in 146 BC, the walls of Carthage were breached and the Roman army stormed into the city. The ensuing massacre was systematic and brutal. According to the ancient historian Polybius, the Romans slaughtered hundreds of thousands of Carthaginian civilians, leaving only a small number of survivors. Of the approximately 700,000 inhabitants of Carthage before the siege, only 50,000 survived. These fortunate few were enslaved and scattered throughout the vast Roman Empire, their fate sealed as the property of their conquerors. The massacre was only the beginning. The Roman army did not stop at killing the inhabitants. Once the resistance was crushed, they set out to destroy the city entirely. Polybius, who witnessed the aftermath, described the scene as one of the most terrifying sights of his life. The buildings of Carthage, once symbols of its grandeur, were reduced to ashes, and the streets, normally bustling with commerce and culture, were covered in corpses. The burning sun reflected the smoke and ruins, and the city became a desert of death and desolation. According to the historian Appian, the cruelty of the Romans knew no bounds. The last defenders of Carthage, many of them unarmed civilians, were massacred without mercy. As the Romans razed the city, they left no survivors. Women, children, and the elderly were murdered indiscriminately, regardless of age or gender, reflecting Rome's vengeful fury. The destruction of Carthage was not simply an act of war, it was a deliberate attempt to erase an entire civilization. The Romans not only destroyed the physical city, but also sought to wipe out its cultural and commercial legacy. The decision to remove Carthage from the face of the earth was a clear message from Rome to all its potential enemies. The defeat of Rome meant absolute destruction, not just of armies, but of entire cultures. This act of extermination marked the culmination of centuries of hostility between 2 powers that had fought for supremacy in the Mediterranean. In the end, Rome not only defeated Carthage, but erased all traces of its existence. In the following decades, the territory of Carthage was salted, a symbolic technique intended to ensure the city could never rise again. This salting act was a metaphor for total destruction, symbolizing Carthage's inability to produce anything that could be reborn. The fall of Carthage left an indelible mark on Roman historical memory. The victory was a testament to Roman power, but also to the brutality with which Rome could act when it felt threatened. The city that had once been a beacon of wealth and culture was now nothing more than a reminder of the horrors of war. The Third Punic War and the annihilation of Carthage remain a symbol of the unstoppable force of Roman war machinery, but also of the darkness that can cloud ethics in times of war. Unimaginable torture, the Assyrian Empire. If there is an empire that embodies absolute brutality, it is the Assyrian Empire. From the 10th to the 7th century BCE, the Assyrians dominated a vast region of Mesopotamia, extending their influence from northern Mesopotamia to the Levant and Egypt. Their success was not only based on their military prowess, but also on their inhumane psychological warfare strategy, which instilled fear in all those who fell under their yoke. Over the centuries, the Assyrians not only won battles, but became masters of torture and public humiliation, using pain as a tool to destroy the will of resistance in their enemies. Assyrian kings like Ashurnasirpal II and Tiglath-Pileser III took pride in their ability to inflict suffering. Inscriptions on the walls of their palaces and temples coldly detailed the acts of violence they committed, displaying their capacity to instill maximum terror. Throughout their reign, the Assyrians developed a macabre reputation for being experts in torture. Rather than simply defeating their enemies, they sought to break their spirit and make an example of them to deter any future attempts at rebellion. Torture became a psychological weapon, a brutal reminder that resisting Assyrian power meant facing indescribable suffering. One of the most infamous and terrifying methods used by the Assyrians was flaying. According to inscriptions from the Assyrian kings themselves, they would strip their prisoners alive and then tear off their skin, publicly displaying it on the walls of the conquered cities. This act was not only a display of power, but also a statement of humiliation toward those who dared to challenge Assyrian supremacy. The flayed skins were hung as trophies, a testament to the invincibility of the Assyrians and a terrifying warning to anyone thinking of rebelling. The historian Diodorus Siculus, in his Bibliotheca Historica, recounted that the Assyrians often cut off the limbs of their prisoners, leaving them to die slowly in excruciating pain. These acts were not merely punitive but aimed to demonstrate Assyrian superiority through a public display of mutilation. These prisoners, reduced to mere objects of torture, served as spectacles of terror for those who watched. The Assyrians, far from hiding their actions, proclaimed their cruelty as proof of their absolute power. The cities that dared to rebel against Assyrian rule were subjected to relentless vengeance. Tens of thousands of inhabitants from cities such as Damascus and Susa were captured, and in many cases, publicly decapitated. Mass decapitation was seen as an act of humiliation and a way to show that opposition to the Assyrians was not only futile but also fatal. However, in some cases, burning prisoners alive became a common practice, an act of total destruction of the identity of the rebellious city. The victims of the mass executions were not only male soldiers, but also women and children who were not spared under Assyrian rule. Prisoners had no hope of survival, as the Assyrians' intent was to completely eradicate any trace of resistance. These massacres were part of a terror strategy aimed at ensuring no people could rise against the empire. However, the same brutality that cemented the Assyrian Empire's expansion ironically contributed to its downfall. The Assyrians made too many enemies, and over time, a coalition of oppressed peoples began to unite against them. In the 7th century BCE, the Babylonians, Medes, and Scythians rose against the Assyrian Empire, sacking the Assyrian capital of Nineveh and bringing an end to their rule. The very machinery of terror that had made the Assyrians feared throughout the Near East was defeated by a coalition of peoples who, in the end, avenged the oppression and violence they had suffered for centuries. The fall of Nineveh and the disappearance of the Assyrian Empire not only marked the end of an empire, but also closed a chapter of terror, where torture and suffering were the preferred weapons of an empire whose legacy remains one of the darkest and most brutal in ancient history. Biological warfare, the cruelty of Genghis Khan. The Mongol Empire of Genghis Khan at its peak covered vast regions of Asia and parts of Europe. It is remembered not only for its astonishing territorial expansion, but also for its unparalleled brutality and mass executions. However, what truly sets the Mongol Empire apart from other ancient empires is its systematic use of terror strategies involving not only immediate death, but also the manipulation of biological weapons to spread fear and chaos. The massacres and biological warfare waged by the Mongols not only devastated cities, but also marked a turning point in the history of military conquests. One of the most horrifying episodes of Mongol expansion occurred in 1346 CE, during the siege of the city of Kaffa in present-day Crimea, which was under Genoese control. For years, the Genoese had resisted the Mongols' attempts to take the city. But when the siege reached a stalemate, the Mongols decided to resort to a macabre and unprecedented tactic. According to several historical chronicles, the Mongol general, a descendant of Genghis Khan, launched plague-infected corpses over the city walls of Kaffa. The Mongol corpses were catapulted over the walls of Kaffa, bringing with them death in the form of the plague. Many historians believe this event was crucial in the spread of the Black Death in Europe and Asia, which would kill more than 25 million people in Europe alone in the following years. Although the exact relationship between the siege of Kaffa and the outbreak of the plague is still debated, the biological warfare tactic used by the Mongols in this episode represents one of the first known examples of bioterrorism in military history. The cruelty of the Mongols was not limited to biological warfare. They were also notorious for their mass executions, which wiped out everything in their path. One such example occurred in 1221 CEE, when the Mongols captured the city of Nishapur in what is now Iran. The city had been the site of a rebellion that resulted in the death of one of Genghis Khan's sons-in-law, and as punishment, the Mongol leader ordered a total massacre. According to Juvayni, the Persian historian who documented these events, the Mongol soldiers killed the entire population of the city, from men to women and children, with estimates pointing to a chilling 1.7 million deaths. The magnitude of this massacre shocked the medieval world, and the city of Nishapur was reduced to a heap of corpses, a reminder of Genghis Khan's relentless will to avenge any challenge to his authority. This massacre was just one of many throughout the Mongol campaigns. Often, cities that resisted were completely destroyed, with their inhabitants massacred, enslaved, or deported. The Mongols not only annihilated the fighters but made sure that every city they subdued was completely wiped off the face of the earth. Another example of Mongol brutality took place in the city of Merv, in what is now Turkmenistan. In 1221, Merv was taken by the Mongols after fierce resistance. In retaliation for the losses suffered, Genghis Khan ordered the total annihilation of the city, where around 1 million people died. Historical accounts mention how the Mongols left no survivors, applying the same principle of total destruction that characterized other conquests. The victims were slaughtered mercilessly, and the few survivors were enslaved. The Mongol tactics were systematic. Any city that resisted was destroyed, and its inhabitants were treated with relentless brutality. This approach also included sexual exploitation as an integral component of their campaigns. Genghis Khan himself, during his conquests, fathered hundreds, if not thousands, of children, indicating that, in addition to his efforts to subjugate peoples through terror, he also exploited the conflict to expand his lineage. In cities like Nishapur and Merv, Mongol soldiers took surviving women as war booty, an act that was part of a systematic policy of humiliation and exploitation. The Mongol conquests spread rapidly, sweeping everything in their path. The brutality of their tactics not only affected the cities of the Middle East, but also left an indelible mark on Eastern Europe. The massacres of entire villages, the destruction of cities, and the constant threat of the Mongols changed the way the world viewed war and violence. The fear of the Mongols became a symbol of terror, and many of their enemies were quickly subdued, not only by military force, but by the threat of total destruction. Races and destruction by the Vikings, the wrath of the North. The Viking Age, approximately 793 to 1066 AD, is one of the most feared and mysterious periods in European history. Although the Vikings are often recognized as explorers and traders, their legacy is marked by the brutality of their raids and the relentless destruction they brought with them. These Nordic warriors, hailing from the cold lands of Scandinavia, were known for their ferocity and their ability to strike with astonishing speed, unleashing a terror that transcended borders. Throughout their expansion, their raids were so devastating that they forever changed the course of medieval history. In 793 AD, one of the first and bloodiest Viking raids took place at the Lindisfarne Monastery, on the coast of Northumbria, England. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a key historical text, describes the event as a great massacre, an unexpected attack that plunged the monastery's inhabitants into absolute panic. The Vikings, led by Lothbrok or one of his successors, raided this sacred place without mercy, killing the monks, looting religious treasures and setting fire to everything they could. This was no ordinary pillage. The Vikings not only took wealth, but also destroyed a spiritual center of great importance to Christianity in northern Europe. This attack was not just a display of force, but a symbol of supremacy. The Vikings sought to instill fear, showing the world that their warriors respected neither borders nor religious beliefs. Lindisfarne became a symbol of Viking terror, and many monasteries along the coasts of England, Ireland, and France would fall victim to similar raids in the following centuries. The Lindisfarne raid was just the beginning of a series of attacks that terrified medieval Europe for over 200 years. The Viking raids were not only about acquiring wealth, they were a form of psychological warfare. These Nordic warriors were known for their ability to strike unexpectedly, often in the early hours of the morning when villages and monasteries were still asleep. Entire villages were destroyed, and the survivors were enslaved or driven out, leaving behind a trail of devastation. The Vikings used longships, which allowed them to reach the most distant coasts quickly. These ships were specifically designed to maneuver in shallow waters, enabling them to attack hard-to-reach places without giving the local populations time to prepare or defend themselves. The speed and surprise of their attacks became their trademark, and the communities that fell before them rarely had the chance to react. One of the most iconic episodes of Viking destruction occurred in 845 AD, when a Viking army, led by the legendary Ragnar Lodbrok, sacked Paris. During this attack, the Vikings not only ravaged the city but also demanded payment for their withdrawal, an act of humiliation that would mark a new era in Viking-European relations. Paris, a major political and commercial hub, was humbled before the Nordic power, making it clear that no place was safe. The Viking raids left not only a toll of death and destruction, but also profoundly transformed the social and cultural structures of Europe. Many villages and cities that were attacked were forced to fortify themselves, while the constant fear of a raid led to changes in the military strategies of European kingdoms. However, the Vikings also left a significant cultural legacy, which included influences on the language, art, and religion of the regions they conquered. Despite their destructive nature, the Vikings also played a role as explorers, traders, and founders of cities like Normandy in France and Kiev in Ukraine, leaving a lasting mark on European history. The destruction of Alexandria, the crime of Julius Caesar. One of the most shocking and devastating war crimes of antiquity was not limited to the massacre of populations or the physical destruction of cities, but also included the annihilation of one of the most advanced centers of knowledge of its time, the Library of Alexandria. This act took place in 47 BC, when Julius Caesar, in his quest to consolidate his power in the Roman world, became involved in a series of political conflicts in Egypt that resulted in the destruction of Alexandria, the most iconic city of the ancient world. Alexandria, the jewel of Egypt, and one of the main centers of learning in the ancient civilization, was under the control of Ptolemy XIII, a young pharaoh whose reign was threatened by his sister Cleopatra, who was fighting for the throne. Julius Caesar, in his role as the military leader of Rome, intervened in the dynastic dispute, supporting Cleopatra in her struggle for power. This led to a violent siege of the city of Alexandria, a strategically important city both for its geographical location and its immense cultural value. The history of the siege is primarily known through Caesar's own accounts, which he described in his memoirs, Commentarii de Bello Civili, Commentaries on the Civil War. According to Caesar, the conflict was brief but extremely destructive. The city was completely besieged, and Caesar's forces, facing resistance from those loyal to Ptolemy XIII, launched a violent assault to gain control of the city. In this context, the destruction of Alexandria was more than a simple act of war. It was a deliberate act of cultural dismantling. The most tragic aspect of this episode was the fate of the Library of Alexandria, which at that time housed millions of scrolls and texts on astronomy, mathematics, philosophy, literature, and many other sciences. At its peak, the library was a symbol of knowledge and intellectual prowess in the ancient world, and its destruction marked an irreparable milestone in human history. Although the final fate of the library remains a topic of debate, what is clear is that the fire caused during the siege of the city by Caesar led to the loss of an incalculable number of texts, many of which were never recovered. The fact that the destruction of the library was largely a cultural war crime rather than a simple collateral victim makes it one of the most surprising and devastating war crimes in history. Caesar and his troops, by setting parts of the city on fire to gain ground, destroyed not only homes and buildings but an entire legacy of knowledge accumulated over centuries. The fire destroyed large areas of the harbor, and with it, a significant part of the library. Furthermore, the looting that occurred after the Roman victory took on an even more horrific dimension. The population of Alexandria, after the fall of the city, was stripped of its wealth and subjected to slavery or mass execution. Although the exact details of the deaths of the inhabitants vary depending on the sources, many accounts point to a brutal cleansing of the remaining population. The survivors were sold as slaves or scattered throughout the Roman Empire, while the temples and buildings of the city were looted and destroyed. It is important to remember that the city was not only the center of political power, but also a cultural epicenter where renowned thinkers, scientists, and philosophers resided. The loss of the texts stored in the Library of Alexandria represented an irreparable blow not only to Egypt, but to the entire world. It is estimated that during the siege and subsequent fires, tens of thousands of texts were lost forever, destroying the legacy of some of the brightest minds of humanity at the time. The brutality of Caesar and his army not only left tens of thousands dead, but also marked an irrevocable break with the past, eliminating centuries of knowledge that could have accelerated advancements in science, arts, and philosophy. While Caesar may have seen his victory as a political justification, the cultural and scientific damage caused by the destruction of Alexandria left deep scars in the ancient world, whose effects were felt for centuries. In summary, the siege of Alexandria and the destruction of the Library of Alexandria were not only a physical massacre, but also an act that destroyed an invaluable treasure of ancient wisdom, becoming one of the most shocking war crimes ever recorded. This act of cultural brutality highlights the often forgotten dimension of war crimes in antiquity, where human knowledge, collective memory, and wisdom were sacrificed at the altar of conquest and military power. Conclusion: war crimes in antiquity are some of the darkest and most chilling episodes in human history. From the systematic massacre of the Carthaginians to the brutal tactics of the Assyrians and the Mongols, these events not only altered the course of civilizations, but also revealed the extreme measures that ancient leaders were willing to take to secure their dominance. These acts of violence were not only an integral part of the military strategies of their time, but also left deep traces in the societies that lived through them. The magnitude of these crimes raises questions about the lasting impact of such episodes on the historical memory of peoples. In many cases, the destruction was total, and cities never returned to their former state. When reviewing these events, it is impossible not to consider the nature of power and violence in armed conflicts, and how these acts of war continue to be studied today as a fundamental part of ancient history. What these crimes left behind serves as a reminder of the brutal realities of war in its most extreme form.